The whistle of the westbound train cut through the Texas morning like a blade, sharp and final. Margaret Hayes pressed her palm against the cool window glass, watching the endless prairie roll past in waves of golden grass beneath a sky so vast it made her feel impossibly small. Beside her, 6-year-old Daniel slept fitfully against her shoulder, his dark hair damp with perspiration, despite the October chill that had settled over the plains. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days they had been traveling from St. Louis. 3 days of soot and uncertainty, of carefully rationed meals and restless nights in cramped seats. 3 days later, Margaret had sold every possession of value she owned to purchase their tickets west, betting everything on a correspondence that had sustained her through the darkest months of her life. The conductor's voice boomed through the car. "Clearwater Station, next stop. Clearwater, Texas." Margaret's stomach clenched with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After 6 months of letters, after careful planning and desperate hope, she was about to meet the man who had promised her a new life. Robert Whitman, successful, cattle rancher, respected member of his community, seeking a proper wife to share his prosperous life in the Texas hill country. She had been honest about being widowed. She had mentioned that her late husband had left her in difficult circumstances. What she had not explicitly stated was that Daniel existed, that her difficult circumstances included a bright, energetic boy who asked endless questions and needed a father figure as much as she needed a husband. The omission had been calculated, born of desperation rather than deception. After responding to dozens of advertisements from men seeking wives, Margaret had learned that mentioning a child resulted in immediate silence. No matter how she phrased it, how she emphasized Daniel's good behavior and quick mind, potential suitors disappeared the moment they learned she came as a package deal. So she had crafted her letters to Robert Whitman carefully, honestly describing herself as a 26-year-old widow with household skills, education, and a desire to build a respectable life in the growing frontier. She had shared details about her late husband's work as a shopkeeper, her own experience managing their small business, and her dreams of contributing to a thriving ranch community. Every word had been true, just incomplete. Now, as the train began its approach to Clearwater Station, Margaret's carefully constructed hope felt as fragile as spun glass. What if Robert Whitman proved to be another Thomas Reynolds type, more concerned with appearances than substance? What if he took one look at Daniel and decided their arrangement was null and void? "Mama?" Daniel stirred awake, blinking up at her with eyes the same shade of green as his father's had been. "Are we there? Is this where we're going to live?" Margaret smoothed his unruly hair, straightening his small jacket and retying the string that held his precious collection of carved wooden animals secure in a cloth pouch. "Yes, sweetheart, this is Clearwater. Remember what we talked about?" Daniel nodded solemnly, suddenly wide awake and alert. "Be polite and helpful. Don't interrupt grown-up conversations. Say sir and ma'am." He paused, worrying about his lower lip. "But Mama, what if he doesn't like me?" The question pierced Margaret's heart. Daniel had endured too much uncertainty for a child his age, too many changes and disappointments. When cholera had taken his father 2 years ago, leaving them with debts that consumed everything they owned, Daniel had adapted with resilience that both amazed and worried her. He deserved stability, security, a man who would see his potential rather than viewing him as a burden. "Any man would be lucky to have you as a son," she told him firmly, meaning every word. "You're kind, smart, and brave. Those are the qualities that matter." Through the window, Clearwater emerged from the landscape like a promise half kept. It was larger than she had expected, with a proper main street lined with substantial buildings, church spires reaching toward the cloudless sky, and the bustle of commerce that spoke of prosperity. Beyond the town, rolling hills stretched to the horizon, dotted with oak trees and crossed by silver ribbons of creek beds. The train shuddered to a halt with a great hiss of steam. Margaret gathered their single traveling bag, checked that Daniel's wooden animals were secure, and led him toward the door. Her legs felt unsteady as they stepped onto the wooden platform. Whether from 3 days of travel or from nerves, she couldn't say. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of wood smoke and dried grass that were nothing like the heavy, industrial smell of St. Louis. Around them, other passengers hurried about their business, greeting family members, directing porters with luggage, calling out to friends. Margaret stood still for a moment, scanning the faces for one that might belong to Robert Whitman. She spotted him immediately. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a clean white shirt beneath a brown leather vest. He stood near the station house with the confident posture of a man accustomed to being noticed. His dark hair was neatly combed, his boots polished, his whole appearance speaking of success and respectability. When their eyes met across the platform, he smiled and began walking toward them. Margaret's heart sank as she watched his expression change. The welcoming smile faltered as his gaze moved from her face to Daniel, standing quietly at her side. She saw the exact moment when understanding dawned, when he realized that his mail-order bride came with complications he hadn't bargained for. "Miss Hayes?" His voice was carefully controlled, but she caught the note of confusion beneath the politeness. "Mrs. Hayes," she corrected gently, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Whitman. Thank you for the travel arrangements." He shook her hand briefly, his attention already returning to Daniel. "And this is my son, Daniel." Margaret placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Daniel, this is Mr. Whitman." Daniel executed a perfect bow, just as Margaret had taught him. "Pleased to meet you, sir. Thank you for letting us come to Texas." The courtesy seemed to catch Robert off guard. He studied the boy for a long moment, taking in Daniel's neat appearance, his respectful demeanor, the way he stood close to his mother without hiding behind her skirts. "You didn't mention a child in your letters," Robert said finally, his voice neutral, but his meaning clear. Margaret lifted her chin, refusing to show the panic clawing at her chest. "I mentioned that I was widowed under difficult circumstances. Daniel is my son. He's well-behaved, intelligent, and quite helpful around a household. I'm sure he is." Robert's tone suggested otherwise. "But Mrs. Hayes, I was expecting to marry a woman, not to suddenly acquire a ready-made family." "He's just a little boy," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "He won't be in any trouble. He can help with chores when he's older, and—" "That's not the point." Robert glanced around the platform, clearly aware of the curious stares their conversation was attracting. "I have a position in this community to consider. I can't suddenly appear with a wife and child without proper explanations." Daniel tugged at Margaret's skirt. "Mama, does he not want us?" The innocent question, delivered in a whisper that nevertheless, carried in the crisp air, seemed to strike Robert like a physical blow. Several nearby passengers had stopped their own activities to watch the drama unfolding, and Margaret saw disapproval on more than one face. Disapproval directed not at her, but at the man rejecting a child. "Mr. Whitman," Margaret said quietly, "perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private." He shook his head, his jaw set in stubborn lines. "There's nothing to discuss, Mrs. Hayes. I paid for one train ticket, but the debt is now settled. But I cannot proceed with an arrangement that was made under false pretenses." "False pretenses?" Anger flared in Margaret's chest, hot and protective. "I never lied to you. I told you I was a widow seeking a new start. That's exactly what I am. You omitted crucial information." Robert settled his hat more firmly on his head, the gesture indicating finality. The afternoon stage to San Antonio leaves at 3 o'clock. I suggest you make arrangements to return to Missouri. With what money? Margaret wanted to scream. She had spent every cent she possessed on their journey to Texas, believing in good faith that Robert Whitman was an honorable man who would keep his word. Instead, she found herself stranded in a strange town with a confused little boy and less than $5 to her name. "Mr. Whitman," she tried once more, "surely we can—" But he was already walking away, his back rigid with disapproval, leaving Margaret and Daniel standing alone on the platform with their single bag and shattered hopes. "Mama." Daniel's voice was small and uncertain. "Why doesn't he want us? Did I do something wrong?" Margaret knelt beside her son, gathering him into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair to steady herself. Around them, the platform was emptying as passengers departed with their families, leaving her feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart," she whispered fiercely. "Nothing at all. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense, but that doesn't mean you're not wonderful exactly as you are." She stood, taking Daniel's hand firmly in hers. They might be stranded, they might be nearly penniless, but she would not let despair take hold. She had survived worse: her husband's death, the loss of their home, the months of poverty, and uncertainty that had driven her to seek a mail-order marriage in the first place. She would find a way forward, with or without Robert Whitman's help. "Come on," she told Daniel, shouldering their bag with determination. "Let's find somewhere to get our bearings and figure out what to do next." The town of Clearwater stretched before them, unknown and challenging, but Margaret Hayes had not traveled 800 miles to give up at the first setback. Somewhere in this frontier community, there had to be opportunity for a woman willing to work hard and a bright boy eager to learn. As they walked toward the main street, Margaret caught sight of a weathered man in work clothes loading supplies into a wagon. He had noticed their exchange with Robert Whitman, she realized, and his expression held something that looked remarkably like sympathy. Perhaps not everyone in Clearwater would judge them as harshly as Robert Whitman had. Perhaps there were still people in this world who understood that family came in many forms, and that love was not diminished by circumstances beyond one's control. Margaret held Daniel's hand tighter and walked toward their uncertain future with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Clearwater Hotel stood at the corner of Main and Church Streets, a two-story building with faded blue paint and a hand-carved sign that had seen better days. Margaret hesitated at the entrance, Daniel's small hand warm in hers, calculating and recalculating the coins in her purse. $3.47. Even if the proprietor charged the most modest rate possible, they could afford perhaps 2 nights, maybe 3, if she could negotiate a reduced price for helping with laundry or kitchen work. The lobby smelled of lye soap and tobacco smoke, with worn but clean furniture arranged around a pot-bellied stove. Behind the registration desk sat a woman perhaps 10 years older than Margaret, her greying hair pulled back severely and her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the new arrival's appearance. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Margaret approached the desk with what she hoped was confident composure. "I wonder if you might have a room available for my son and myself." The woman's gaze moved pointedly to their single, worn traveling bag, then to Daniel, who was examining a display of local mineral specimens with the intense curiosity of childhood. "You'd be the one Robert Whitman was expecting on today's train." It wasn't a question. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Clearwater, and their very public rejection at the train station had clearly already made the rounds. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I am Margaret Hayes, yes, and this is my son, Daniel." Mrs. Caldwell's expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. Rooms $2 a night, meals extra if you want them. Sent up, payment in advance, $2. Margaret's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. That seems quite reasonable. We'll take the room for 2 nights to start. As she counted out the precious coins, Mrs. Caldwell continued her assessment. Whitman mentioned he was expecting a widow woman. Didn't say nothing about no child. He didn't ask, Margaret replied simply, refusing to be drawn into gossip. Man's got a right to know what he's getting into, Mrs. Caldwell observed, making no effort to lower her voice. Running a ranch ain't no place for a woman who can't be honest about her circumstances. The criticism stung, particularly because Margaret had wrestled with the ethics of her omission throughout the journey from Missouri. But desperation had driven her to calculated silence, and she would not apologize for protecting her son's interests. A man also has a right to honor his word once given, she replied quietly, accepting the heavy brass key Mrs. Caldwell offered. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the bustling main street. Daniel immediately went to the window, pressing his nose against the glass to watch the activity below. Look, Mama, there's a real blacksmith shop and a man with a horse that's bigger than our whole parlor back home. Margaret set their bag on the bed and joined him at the window. Clearwater was indeed a thriving community with obvious signs of prosperity and growth. Wagons loaded with goods moved steadily along the main thoroughfare. Women in clean dresses emerged from well-stocked shops, and men in business attire conducted transactions on the wooden sidewalks. This was exactly the sort of place where an industrious woman might build a new life, if she could find a way to establish herself. "Are we going to stay here, Mama?" Daniel asked, his voice holding the careful neutrality he had developed during the uncertain months following his father's death. "For a few days, while I figure out our next steps," Margaret answered honestly. She had learned that Daniel handled uncertainty better when he understood as much of the truth as his young mind could process. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret opened it to find a woman, perhaps her own age, dressed in a practical brown dress with an apron that spoke of recent kitchen work. Her brown hair was neatly braided, and her face held the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be feigned. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Susan Martinez. I run the bakery down the street." She glanced past Margaret to where Daniel was still absorbed in his window observations. "I heard about what happened at the station. Thought you might appreciate some fresh bread and perhaps some information about our town." The unexpected kindness nearly undid Margaret's carefully maintained composure. "That's very generous of you, Mrs. Martinez. Please come in." Susan entered, carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf that filled the small room with the heavenly scent of fresh-baked bread. She studied Margaret with intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. "Call me Susan, and don't mind Mrs. Caldwell's commentary. She means no real harm, but she's never had to make the kinds of choices desperate circumstances require." Susan's accent carried traces of her Mexican heritage, softening her words with musical cadences. "I came to Clearwater 5 years ago, with nothing but a sourdough starter and the clothes on my back, fleeing a husband who thought his fists were appropriate tools for expressing displeasure." Margaret's eyes widened at the frank admission. "I'm sorry, that must have been terrifying." "It was, but I discovered that sometimes running toward uncertainty is braver than staying with known misery." Susan glanced at Daniel, who had turned from the window at the mention of bread. "And I learned that this town, for all its capacity for gossip, is generally fair to those willing to work hard and contribute to the community." Daniel approached shyly, drawn by the wonderful smell emanating from Susan's bundle. "That smells like the bread Mama used to make when Papa was alive." Susan smiled, unwrapping the loaf to reveal a perfectly golden crust. "Would you like to try a piece? I added a touch of honey to the dough this morning." As Daniel savored his bread with the enthusiasm of a child who had subsisted on train food for 3 days, Susan turned her attention back to Margaret. "I don't suppose you have any particular skills or experience that might translate to employment here in Clearwater?" Margaret straightened, recognizing an opportunity when it presented itself. "I managed my late husband's dry goods store for 3 years. I can keep books, handle inventory, serve customers, and manage staff when necessary. I'm also an accomplished seamstress and have experience with both household management and basic medical care." Impressive credentials. Susan's eyes had sharpened with interest. As it happens, several businesses in town have been struggling to find reliable help. The growth Clearwater has experienced has outpaced the available workforce, particularly for positions requiring literacy and mathematical skills. Hope flickered in Margaret's chest, the first genuine optimism she had felt since stepping off the train. "Do you think there might be opportunities for someone in my situation?" "I think there might indeed." Susan lowered her voice slightly, though Daniel was far too absorbed in his bread to pay attention to adult conversation. "Robert Whitman's rejection of you this morning has already stirred considerable discussion. Not all of it is unfavorable to your cause." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Robert Whitman is, well, let's say he's a man very concerned with appearances and social standing. Some folks admire that quality, others find it lacking in Christian charity." Susan paused meaningfully, "particularly when it involves rejecting a child who has done nothing wrong." Before Margaret could respond, another knock came at the door. This time, Mrs. Caldwell's voice called through the wood. "Mrs. Hayes, you've got a visitor downstairs. Says he's got business to discuss." Margaret's pulse quickened. Perhaps Robert Whitman had reconsidered, realized the harshness of his decision. She smoothed her traveling dress and checked that Daniel's face was clean of breadcrumbs. "I'll come down with you," Susan offered. "If it's Whitman, you might benefit from having a witness to whatever he has to say." The man waiting in the hotel lobby was not Robert Whitman. Instead, a thin gentleman in an expensive suit stood examining the mineral display with the air of someone accustomed to being kept waiting. He turned as Margaret descended the stairs, his pale eyes assessing her with clinical detachment. "Mrs. Hayes, I am Howard Beckham, attorney at law." He produced a calling card from his vest pocket. "I represent the interests of several prominent citizens of Clearwater, including Mr. Robert Whitman." Margaret's heart sank. Whatever this was, it would not be good news. "Mr. Beckham, how may I help you?" "Mr. Whitman has expressed concern about your situation here in Clearwater. As a respected member of our community, he feels a certain responsibility to ensure that appropriate arrangements are made for your departure." The carefully neutral language didn't disguise the message. Robert Whitman wanted her gone, and he was prepared to use legal pressure to achieve that goal. "I'm not aware of any law preventing a widow and her child from seeking employment in Texas," Margaret replied carefully. Beckham's smile was thin and cold. "Of course not. However, there are vagrancy laws and regulations concerning the welfare of children. A woman without means of support, traveling with a minor child, might find herself subject to uncomfortable scrutiny from local authorities." The threat was delicately veiled but unmistakable. Comply, or face the possibility of having Daniel taken. From her on grounds of inadequate provision, Susan stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of an established business owner. "Mr. Beckham, I believe you may be misinformed about Mrs. Hayes's circumstances. She is not without means of support. In fact, I am considering offering her employment at my bakery." It was a lie, or at least a significant exaggeration of their brief conversation upstairs, but Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for the unexpected support. Beckham's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Martinez, I would caution you against making hasty decisions regarding employees. The character and background of those we associate with in business reflects upon our own reputations. My reputation was built by my own actions, not by cowering before bullies, Susan replied evenly. Good day, Mr. Beckham. The attorney's jaw tightened at the dismissal, but he was too much of a professional to allow his anger to show openly. Instead, he turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Hayes, I trust you will give serious consideration to the wisdom of seeking opportunities elsewhere. Clearwater is a close-knit community that values stability and traditional arrangements. After he departed, Margaret sank into one of the lobby chairs, her legs suddenly weak. The full weight of her situation was becoming clear. She wasn't just facing economic hardship. She was confronting active hostility from someone with enough influence to make her life genuinely difficult. Don't let him frighten you, Susan said firmly, taking the chair beside her. Beckham represents money and privilege, but he doesn't represent the entire town. There are plenty of people here who believe in judging others by their actions rather than their circumstances. But are there enough? Margaret asked quietly. And do they have enough influence to counter a man like Robert Whitman? Susan was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the complexities of small-town politics and social dynamics. That remains to be seen. But I meant what I said about employment. I do need help at the bakery, and your qualifications suggest you could handle far more than I initially imagined. Margaret looked up sharply. You're serious? Entirely. The work is demanding, the hours are long, and the pay won't make you wealthy. But it's honest employment, and it would give you a foundation to build upon. For the first time since stepping off the train, Margaret felt tears threaten. Not tears of despair, but of relief so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. She'd been prepared for rejection, had steeled herself for hardship, but she had not dared hope for genuine kindness from a stranger. I don't know how to thank you, she managed. Thank me by proving that my faith in you is well placed, Susan replied practically, and by not letting the Robert Whitmans of the world convince you that you're worth less than you are. Mama? Daniel appeared at the bottom of the stairs, having apparently grown tired of watching the street activity from their room. Is everything all right? Margaret opened her arms, and he came to her without hesitation, settling onto her lap with the easy trust that made her more determined than ever to create a stable life for him. Everything is going to be fine, sweetheart, she told him. And for the first time since leaving Missouri, she actually believed it might be true. We're going to stay in Clearwater for a while, and I'm going to work for Mrs. Martinez at her bakery. Daniel's face lit up. The lady with the good bread. Can I help sometimes too? Susan laughed, a sound full of genuine warmth. I think we can find some appropriate tasks for a helpful young man. Do you know anything about kneading dough? As Daniel launched into an enthusiastic description of helping his mother with bread making back in Missouri, Margaret felt something settle in her chest. It wasn't quite peace. There were still too many uncertainties for that, but it was hope, solid and real. Robert Whitman had rejected them, Howard Beckham had threatened them, and Mrs. Caldwell clearly disapproved of their very existence. But Susan Martinez had offered them a chance. And sometimes a chance was all that stood between despair and possibility. Margaret held her son close and began to plan their next steps, no longer as refugees fleeing rejection, but as people with purpose and the promise of honest work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities. And if Robert Whitman thought he could drive them from Clearwater through intimidation and social pressure, he was about to discover that Margaret Hayes had not traveled 800 miles to surrender at the first sign of opposition. Dawn came early to Clearwater, and with it the sounds of a community stirring to life. Margaret had slept poorly in the unfamiliar bed, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. But she rose with determination. Today would mark the beginning of her new life, whatever form it might take. Susan Martinez's bakery occupied a corner building on Main Street, its windows already glowing with warm lamplight as Margaret approached with Daniel in tow. The painted sign above the door read Esperanza Bakery in cheerful yellow letters, and the sweet aroma of baking bread drifted through the cool morning air. Esperanza means hope, Susan explained as she unlocked the front door to let them in. Seemed appropriate when I was starting over with nothing but faith and flour. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with glass display cases along one wall, small tables arranged for customers who wished to sit and enjoy their purchases, and a work area visible through an archway that led to the kitchen. Proper. Everything was scrupulously clean and efficiently organized, speaking to Susan's competence and attention to detail. "Daniel, would you like to see where we make the magic happen?" Susan asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. The boy's eyes widened as they entered the work area. Two massive ovens dominated one wall, their cast-iron doors decorated with intricate scrollwork. Long wooden tables provided workspace for kneading and shaping, while shelves lined with mixing bowls, measuring cups, and specialized tools created an atmosphere of purposeful industry. "It's like a castle kitchen," Daniel breathed, clearly enchanted. Susan laughed. "I suppose it is, in a way. Would you like to help me start the day's bread while your mother and I discuss business?" As Daniel was introduced to the mysteries of measuring flour and testing yeast, Susan walked Margaret through the practical aspects of employment at Esperanza Bakery. "I open at 5 each morning to begin the day's baking," she explained. "Most of our bread sales happen between 7 and 9, when people stop by before work or send their children for family purchases. The afternoon brings cake orders, special requests, and preparation for the next day." Margaret watched Susan's capable hands demonstrate proper kneading technique while mentally calculating the logistics of her new routine. "What about Daniel? I can't leave him alone at the hotel, and I don't want him to be a disruption to your business." "Actually, I've been thinking about that." Susan glanced at the boy, who was concentrating fiercely on following her instructions for shaping dough. "I could use someone to help with deliveries to the restaurant and hotel. Nothing too heavy, just bread and pastries. A reliable young man with good manners might be exactly what I need." Daniel looked up hopefully. "I could do that. I'm very good at remembering directions, and I'm careful with fragile things." "It wouldn't interfere with his education," Margaret said quickly. "I've been teaching him reading and arithmetic myself, and I intend to continue. Of course, in fact, running. Deliveries might help him learn the town and meet other children his age." Susan covered the shaped loaves with clean cloth. "These need to rise for an hour before baking. Perfect time for us to visit Mrs. Patterson about more permanent housing arrangements." They left Daniel safely occupied with arranging kindling for the ovens under the supervision of Pablo, Susan's assistant baker, a cheerful young man who had immigrated from Mexico the previous year. Margaret was grateful for Susan's company as they walked toward the residential section of Clearwater, where neat houses with well-tended gardens spoke of middle-class prosperity. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house stood on a tree-lined street 3 blocks from the bakery, a substantial 2-story structure with a welcoming front porch and lace curtains in every window. The proprietor herself answered their knock, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Susan, dear, what brings you so early?" Mrs. Patterson's gaze moved curiously to Margaret. "And who might this be?" "Eleanor." "Patterson, I'd like you to meet Margaret Hayes. She's going to be working with me at the bakery, and I was hoping you might have suitable accommodations for her and her young son." Mrs. Patterson studied Margaret with the shrewd assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential tenants. "I heard about the situation at the train station yesterday. Unfortunate business, that. Margaret braced herself for another lecture about honesty and propriety, but Mrs. Patterson's expression held sympathy rather than judgment. "Robert Whitman's loss is our community's gain, I suspect," the older woman continued. "I have a nice room on the second floor that would suit a mother and child perfectly. Meals included, laundry facilities available, and a small sitting area where the boy could do his studies." The terms were more than reasonable, and Margaret felt another piece of her new life falling into place. As they walked back toward the bakery, Susan shared more about the community dynamics that would shape Margaret's experience in Clearwater. "Eleanor Patterson is one of the most respected women in town," she explained. "Her approval carries significant weight with the other business owners and families. If she's willing to house you, others will be more inclined to give you a fair chance." They paused outside the general store, where several women had gathered for morning shopping. Margaret recognized the type immediately: the wives of prosperous men, the arbiters of social acceptability, the ones who could make or break a newcomer's reputation with a few well-placed words. "That's Mrs. Victoria Ashford," Susan murmured, indicating a well-dressed woman with elaborately styled hair. "Her husband owns the largest ranch in the county after Whitman's spread. She's particular about social standings." As if sensing their scrutiny, Mrs. Ashford looked in their direction. Her gaze lingered on Margaret with unmistakable curiosity before she turned back to her companions, their heads immediately bending together in animated conversation. "I suspect I'll be the topic of discussion for some time," Margaret observed. "Wryly, undoubtedly, but don't let that concern you. Victoria Ashford's opinions carry weight, but they're not the final word on anything." Susan's expression grew thoughtful. "Besides, I have a feeling she might surprise you. She's more interested in competence than conformity, despite appearances." They were interrupted by the approach of a tall man leading a horse down the main street. He moved with the easy stride of someone comfortable in his own skin. His clothes, impractical rather than fashionable, his weathered face suggesting years spent outdoors. When he noticed Susan, he changed direction to approach them. "Morning, Susan. How's business?" "Thriving, thanks to people like you who appreciate quality baking." Susan's tone held genuine warmth. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Margaret Hayes. She's going to be helping me at the bakery. Margaret, this is Marcus Donovan. He owns the Double D Ranch south of town." Marcus touched his hat respectfully. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hayes. Welcome to Clearwater." Margaret found herself looking up into grey eyes that held the same direct honesty she had noticed in Susan. There was no judgment in his gaze, no calculation of her worth based on circumstances or social position. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan. I'm looking forward to becoming part of the community." "You picked a good place to settle. Clearwater's got room for anyone willing to work hard and treat their neighbors fairly." His attention shifted to Susan. "Speaking of which, I'll need my usual order for Saturday. The hands are expecting your famous cinnamon rolls after we finish the branding. Of course, I'll have everything ready by dawn." Susan's professional manner couldn't quite hide a subtle warmth when speaking with Marcus. After he continued on his way, Margaret glanced curiously at her new employer. "He seems very different from Mr. Whitman." "Night and day," Susan agreed. "Marcus built his ranch from nothing, working as a hand for other outfits until he could afford his own land. He judges people by their character, not their pedigree." They returned to the bakery to find Daniel proudly displaying a perfectly shaped roll under Pablo's encouraging supervision. The boy's face glowed with accomplishment, and Margaret felt her heart lift at seeing him so engaged and happy. "Look, Mama, Pablo taught me how to make the dough smooth and stretchy. Can I help make rolls every day?" "We'll see," Margaret replied, ruffling his hair. "First, You need to prove you can handle your delivery responsibilities. The morning passed in a blur of activity as Margaret learned the routines and rhythms of the bakery business. She served customers with the same skills she had developed in her late husband's store, managed inventory with practiced efficiency, and gradually began to understand the complex web of relationships that defined Clearwater's commercial district. Around midday, as the lunch crowd began to thin, the bakery door opened to admit a man Margaret hadn't seen before. He was younger than Marcus Donovan, perhaps in his early 30s, with sandy hair and the lean build of someone who spent long hours in physical labor. What caught her attention immediately was the way he moved, with the careful deliberation of someone favoring an old injury. "Afternoon, Susan," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl. "Heard you might have some help today." Susan smiled warmly. "Indeed I do. Tom Bradley, meet Margaret Hayes. Margaret, Tom is our local blacksmith and the most skilled metal worker in the 3 counties. Tom's handshake was firm, despite obvious stiffness in his left arm. "Pleasure, Mrs. Hayes. Welcome to our little corner of Texas." "Thank you. I understand you're a blacksmith. That must be fascinating work. Has its moments." Tom's expression grew more animated. "Keeps me busy, anyway. Lot of ranches in the area, a lot of horses that need shoes and tools that need repair." "Tom's being modest," Susan interjected. "He's an artist with metal. You should see the ironwork he created for the new church." As Tom and Susan discussed his usual order of meat pies for his lunch, Margaret noticed Daniel watching the blacksmith with intense curiosity. The boy had always been drawn to craftsmanship and skilled trades, spending hours watching his father's interactions with suppliers and artisans back in Missouri. "You interested in metalworking, young man?" Tom asked, having noticed Daniel's attention. Daniel nodded eagerly. "My papa used to let me watch Mr. Henderson work at his forge back home. He made horseshoes that looked like they were dancing." Tom's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a craftsman meeting a potential apprentice. "Dancing horseshoes, eh? That's poetry in iron. Tell you what, if your mother doesn't mind, you could stop by my shop sometime. I could show you how to shape a simple nail." Margaret started to decline automatically, but something in Tom's manner stopped her. There was no condescension in his offer, no adult humoring a child's fleeting interest. He was speaking to Daniel as one craftsman to another, regardless of age. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Bradley. Perhaps when Daniel has proven himself reliable with his bakery duties." "Course, work comes first, always." Tom's approval of her priorities was evident. "But craftsmanship is important too. World needs people who understand the value of making things well." As the afternoon progressed, Margaret began to form a clearer picture of Clearwater's social landscape. There were the Robert Whitmans and Howard Beckhams, concerned with status and appearances. But there were also the Susan Martinezes, Marcus Donovans, and Tom Bradleys, people who valued substance over style, character over credentials. The question was whether the second group held enough influence to outweigh the first when it came to determining her family's future in this community. That question gained new urgency when Victoria Ashford herself entered the bakery late in the afternoon, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was an imposing woman, tall and elegantly dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having her opinions sought and respected. "Mrs. Martinez," she said in crisp, cultured tones, "I understand you have a new employee." Susan's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "I do indeed. Margaret Hayes. May I present Mrs. Victoria Ashford? Victoria, this is Margaret." Victoria's assessment was frank and thorough, her pale blue eyes missing nothing about Margaret's appearance, demeanor, or the quality of her work clothes. The scrutiny felt like standing before a judge awaiting verdict. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand you've had rather a dramatic introduction to our community." "Yes, ma'am. Not precisely what I had planned, but sometimes life has its own ideas about our direction. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Approval, perhaps, or at least interest in Margaret's composure under pressure. Indeed, it does. I also understand you have experience in business management. I helped manage my late husband's dry goods store in Missouri for several years. Bookkeeping, inventory, customer service, staff supervision. Victoria nodded slowly. Useful skills. Tell me, Mrs. Hayes, how have you found our little town so avar? The question felt like a test, and Margaret chose her words carefully. I find it full of opportunities for someone willing to work hard and contribute positively to the community. A diplomatic answer. Victoria's slight smile suggested she appreciated the careful phrasing. I trust you'll find Clearwater welcoming to those who prove their worth through actions rather than circumstances. After Victoria departed with a selection of pastries for her evening entertaining, Susan let out a breath Margaret hadn't realized. She'd been holding. That went well, Susan said, relief evident in her voice. Victoria Ashford just gave you her provisional approval. That's no small thing in this town. Mrs. Patterson studied Margaret with the shrewd assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential tenants. I heard about the situation at the train station yesterday. Unfortunate business, that. Margaret braced herself for another lecture about honesty and propriety, but Mrs. Patterson's expression held sympathy rather than judgment. Robert Whitman's loss is our community's gain, I suspect, the older woman continued. I have a nice room on the second floor that would suit a mother and child perfectly. Meals included, laundry facilities available, and a small sitting area where the boy could do his studies. The terms were more than reasonable, and Margaret felt another piece of her new life falling into place. As they walked back toward the bakery, Susan shared more about the community dynamics that would shape Margaret's experience in Clearwater. Eleanor Patterson is one of the most respected women in town, she explained. Her approval carries significant weight with the other business owners and families. If she's willing to house you, others will be more inclined to give you a fair chance. They paused outside the general store, where several women had gathered for morning shopping. Margaret recognized the type immediately. The wives of prosperous men, the arbiters of social acceptability, the ones who could make or break a newcomer's reputation with a few well-placed words. That's Mrs. Victoria Ashford, Susan murmured, indicating a well-dressed woman with elaborately styled hair. Her husband owns the largest ranch in the county after Whitman's spread. She's particular about social standings. As if sensing their scrutiny, Mrs. Ashford looked in their direction. Her gaze lingered on Margaret with unmistakable curiosity before she turned back to her companions, their heads immediately bending together in animated conversation. I suspect I'll be the topic of discussion for some time, Margaret observed. Riley? Undoubtedly. But don't let that concern you. Victoria Ashford's opinions carry weight, but they're not the final word on anything. Susan's expression grew thoughtful. Besides, I have a feeling she might surprise you. She's more interested in competence than conformity, despite appearances. They were interrupted by the approach of a tall man leading a horse down the main street. He moved with the easy stride of someone comfortable in his own skin, his clothes, and practical rather than fashionable, his weathered face suggesting years spent outdoors. When he noticed Susan, he changed direction to approach them. Morning, Susan. How's business? Thriving, thanks to people like you who appreciate quality baking. Susan's tone held genuine warmth. Marcus, I'd like you to meet Margaret Hayes. She's going to be helping me at the bakery. Margaret, this is Marcus Donovan. He owns the Double D Ranch south of town. Marcus touched his hat respectfully. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hayes. Welcome to Clearwater. Margaret found herself looking up into grey eyes that held the same direct honesty she had noticed in Susan. There was no judgment in his gaze, no calculation of her worth based on circumstances or social position. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan. I'm looking forward to becoming part of the community. You picked a good place to settle. Clearwater's got room for anyone willing to work hard and treat their neighbors fairly." His attention shifted to Susan. "Speaking of which, I'll need my usual order for Saturday. The hands are expecting your famous cinnamon rolls after we finish the branding. Of course, I'll have everything ready by dawn." Susan's professional manner couldn't quite hide a subtle warmth when speaking with Marcus. After he continued on his way, Margaret glanced curiously at her new employer. "He seems very different from Mr. Whitman." "Night and day," Susan agreed. "Marcus built his ranch from nothing, working as a hand for other outfits until he could afford his own land. He judges people by their character, not their pedigree." They returned to the bakery to find Daniel proudly displaying a perfectly shaped roll under Pablo's encouraging supervision. The boy's face glowed with accomplishment, and Margaret felt her heart lift at seeing him so engaged and happy. "Look, Mama. Pablo taught me how to make the dough smooth and stretchy. Can I help make rolls every day?" "We'll see," Margaret replied, ruffling his hair. "First, you need to prove you can handle your delivery responsibilities." The morning passed in a blur of activity as Margaret learned the routines and rhythms of the bakery business. She served customers with the same skills she had developed in her late husband's store, managed inventory with practiced efficiency, and gradually began to understand the complex web of relationships that defined Clearwater's commercial district. Around midday, as the lunch crowd began to thin, the bakery door opened to admit a man Margaret hadn't seen before. He was younger than Marcus Donovan, perhaps in his early 30s, with sandy hair and the lean build of someone who spent long hours in physical labor. What caught her attention immediately was the way he moved, with the careful deliberation of someone favoring an old injury. "Afternoon, Susan," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl. "Heard you might have some help today." Susan smiled warmly. "Indeed I do. Tom Bradley, meet Margaret Hayes. Margaret, Tom is our local blacksmith and the most skilled metalworker in the 3 counties. Tom's handshake was firm, despite obvious stiffness in his left arm. "Pleasure, Mrs. Hayes. Welcome to our little corner of Texas." "Thank you. I understand you're a blacksmith. That must be fascinating work." "Has its moments." Tom's expression grew more animated. "Keeps me busy anyway. Lot of ranches in the area, a lot of horses that need shoes and tools that need repair." "Tom's being modest," Susan interjected. "He's an artist with metal. You should see the ironwork he created for the new church." As Tom and Susan discussed his usual order of meat pies for his lunch, Margaret noticed Daniel watching the blacksmith with intense curiosity. The boy had always been drawn to craftsmanship and skilled trades, spending hours watching his father's interactions with suppliers and artisans back in Missouri. "You interested in metalworking, young man?" Tom asked, having noticed Daniel's attention. Daniel nodded eagerly. "My papa used to let me watch Mr. Henderson work at his forge back home. He made horseshoes that looked like they were dancing." Tom's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a craftsman meeting a potential apprentice. "Dancing horseshoes, eh? That's poetry in iron. Tell you what, if your mother doesn't mind, you could stop by my shop sometime. I could show you how to shape a simple nail." Margaret started to decline automatically, but something in Tom's manner stopped her. There was no condescension in his offer, no adult humoring a child's fleeting interest. He was speaking to Daniel as one craftsman to another, regardless of age. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Bradley. Perhaps when Daniel has proven himself reliable with his bakery duties." "Course. Work comes first, always." Tom's approval of her priorities was evident. "But craftsmanship is important too. World needs people who understand the value of making things well." As the afternoon progressed, Margaret began to form a clearer picture of Clearwater's social landscape. There were the Robert Whitmans and Howard Beckhams, concerned with status and appearances. But there were also the Susan Martinezes, Marcus Donovans, and Tom Bradleys, people who valued substance over style, character over credentials. The question was whether the second group held enough influence to outweigh the first when it came to determining her family's future in this community. That question gained new urgency when Victoria Ashford herself entered the bakery late in the afternoon, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was an imposing woman, tall and elegantly dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having her opinions sought and respected. "Mrs. Martinez," she said in crisp, cultured tones, "I understand you have a new employee." Susan's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "I do indeed. Margaret Hayes, may I present Mrs. Victoria Ashford? Victoria, this is Margaret." Victoria's assessment was frank and thorough, her pale blue eyes missing nothing about Margaret's appearance, demeanor, or the quality of her work clothes. The scrutiny felt like standing before a judge awaiting verdict. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand you've had rather a dramatic introduction to our community." "Yes, ma'am. Not precisely what I had planned, but sometimes life has its own ideas about our direction." Something flickered in Victoria's eyes, approval perhaps, or at least interest in Margaret's composure under pressure. "Indeed it does. I also understand you have experience in business management. I helped manage my late husband's dry goods store in Missouri for several years. Bookkeeping, inventory, customer service, staff supervision." Victoria nodded slowly. "Useful skills. Tell me, Mrs. Hayes, how have you found our little town so far?" The question felt like a test, and Margaret chose her words carefully. "I find it full of opportunities for someone willing to work hard and contribute positively to the community." A diplomatic answer. Victoria's slight smile suggested she appreciated the careful phrasing. "I trust you'll find Clearwater welcoming to those who prove their worth through actions rather than circumstances." After Victoria departed with a selection of pastries for her evening entertaining, Susan let out a breath Margaret hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That went well," Susan said, relief evident in her voice. "Victoria Ashford just gave you her provisional approval. That's no small thing in this town." Margaret felt a cautious optimism taking root. Between Eleanor Patterson's boarding house, Susan's employment offer, and now Victoria Ashford's measured acceptance, the foundation for a new life was slowly forming. But as the sun began to set over Clearwater, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret knew that her true test was yet to come. Words of acceptance were one thing. Sustained support in the face of opposition was quite another. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the chances she was being given. And somewhere in this growing frontier town, there had to be someone who would see in Daniel not just a complication or burden, but the wonderful boy he truly was. Someone who might even welcome the chance to be a father to a child who desperately needed one. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret and Daniel had settled into their routine at Eleanor Patterson's boarding house, and the rhythm of their new life was beginning to feel natural rather than foreign. Margaret rose each morning before dawn to help Susan prepare the day's baking, while Daniel had thrown himself into his delivery duties with the enthusiasm of a boy finally given important responsibilities. The October air had grown crisp, bringing with it the first hints of the Texas winter to come. Margaret wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she made her way through the quiet streets to the bakery, her breath visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the dry air. Above her, the stars were fading into the pre-dawn sky, and she found herself appreciating the peaceful solitude of these early morning walks. Inside Esperanza Bakery, Susan was already at work, her hands deep in a massive bowl of bread dough. The ovens radiate warmth throughout the kitchen, creating a cozy refuge against the morning chill. "Good morning," Margaret called softly, not wanting to startle her employer. "How long have you been here?" "About an hour. Couldn't sleep, so I decided to get a head start on the dinner rolls for the Ashford party tonight." Susan looked up with a smile that seemed slightly strained. 20 dozen rolls, plus assorted pastries. Victoria doesn't do anything on a small scale. Margaret tied on her apron and began assembling ingredients for the day's regular production. Over the past weeks, she had learned to read Susan's moods, and something was clearly troubling her friend this morning. "Is everything all right?" "You seem worried." Susan paused in her kneading, considering her words carefully. "It's probably nothing, but I heard some concerning talk at the general store yesterday. About you and Daniel." Margaret's hands stilled on the measuring cup she'd been filling with flour. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing specific, just questions about how long you're planning to stay. Whether you're really settled here or just passing through." Susan resumed her work with perhaps more force than the dough required. Howard Beckham was there, making comments about transient populations and the importance of stable community membership. The implications were clear enough. Robert Whitman and his allies hadn't given up on their campaign to drive Margaret from clear water. They had simply shifted to more subtle tactics. "I see." Margaret set down the measuring cup and faced Susan directly. "Are you having second thoughts about employing me? I would understand if—" "Absolutely not." Susan's response was immediate and fierce. "You're the best help I've ever had, and your presence here has improved my business considerably. Daniel is a treasure, and anyone with eyes can see that. But I worry about the pressure building against you. Beckham has influence, and he's not above using it to make life difficult for people who cross his clients." Susan's expression grew troubled. "I just want you to be prepared for whatever might come next." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Daniel, who burst through the bakery's back door with the barely contained energy of a 6-year-old who had important news to share. "Mama, guess what Mr. Tom showed me yesterday?" He was practically vibrating with excitement, his cheeks flushed from the cold morning air. "Good morning to you too, sweetheart," Margaret said, amused despite her concerns. "What did Mr. Bradley show you? He let me work the bellows for the forge, and he's making a special horseshoe with my initials in it, just for practice." Daniel's eyes shone with hero worship. "He says I have good hands for metalwork, and if I keep practicing, maybe someday I could make beautiful things like the church railings." Margaret felt a familiar tug of emotion at seeing her son so enthusiastic about something. Since his father's death, Daniel had been too serious, too aware of their precarious circumstances. Watching him embrace the wonder of learning a new skill reminded her of the carefree child he had been before tragedy changed their lives. "That's wonderful, Daniel. But remember, your first responsibility is helping Mrs. Martinez with deliveries." "I know, Mama. Mr. Tom says work comes first, always, but he also says it's important to have something that makes your heart happy." Daniel began organizing the delivery baskets with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Tom says his forge work makes his heart happy, even when his arm hurts from the old injury." Susan and Margaret exchanged glances over the boy's head. Tom Bradley had indeed become an important figure in Daniel's life, providing the kind of masculine guidance and mentorship that Margaret couldn't offer herself. The blacksmith's patient teaching and genuine interest in Daniel's development had filled a void neither of them had fully acknowledged. "Speaking of deliveries," Susan said, checking her pocket watch, "the hotel will be expecting their morning pastries soon, and Mrs. Ashford specifically requested that you deliver her party order personally this afternoon." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Personally, that's unusual." "I thought so too, but Victoria Ashford doesn't make idle requests. She has something specific in mind." The morning passed in its usual busy rhythm, with customers flowing steadily through the bakery as the town came alive. Margaret had learned to recognize the regulars, The railroad workers who stopped for coffee and sweet rolls before their shifts, the wives who came to select bread for their families' dinner tables, the children sent with carefully counted coins to purchase treats. Around 10 o'clock, the door chimed to admit Marcus Donovan, his presence immediately noticeable in the way. It seemed to bring a different energy to the room. Margaret had seen him several times since their first meeting, and she was beginning to recognize the subtle signs of his interest, the way his eyes sought her out first when he entered, the careful attention he paid to her words, the genuine warmth in his smile when their gazes met. "Morning, ladies," he said, touching his hat in greeting. "Smells like heaven in here as usual." "Marcus, you flatterer," Susan replied with a grin. "Your usual coffee and bear claw?" "Actually, I was hoping Margaret might have time to discuss a business proposition." His attention turned to her, his grey eyes serious despite his casual tone. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, though whether from nervousness or anticipation, she couldn't say. "Of course, Mr. Donovan. What can I do for you?" "Well, I've been thinking about our conversation last week when you mentioned your experience with bookkeeping and inventory management." Marcus paused, seemingly choosing his words carefully. "The truth is, I'm drowning in paperwork at the ranch. Bills, payroll, supply, orders. It's taking time away from the actual ranching work." Susan made a show of being absorbed in arranging pastries, but Margaret could sense her friend's keen interest in the conversation. "I see," Margaret said carefully. "And you're thinking of hiring someone to help with the administrative work." "I'm thinking of hiring you, specifically, if you're interested, that is." Marcus's directness was refreshing after weeks of navigating Clearwater's complex social undercurrents. The work would be part-time, maybe 2 or 3 afternoons a week at the ranch office. The pay would be fair, and it would give you additional income and experience with ranch operations. The offer was unexpected and appealing on multiple levels. Additional income would provide financial security and independence, while experience with ranch management would expand her skills considerably. But there were also considerations beyond the practical. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Donovan. But I have to think about Daniel. I can't leave him unsupervised, and I wouldn't want him to be a disruption at your ranch." Marcus's expression brightened. "Actually, I was hoping you'd bring him along. I've got a good ranch hand named Jake who's been looking for someone to help with the horses. Daniel strikes me as the kind of boy who'd take to ranch work naturally, and it would be good for him to learn about livestock and land management." Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Here was another adult offering not just tolerance of her son, but genuine enthusiasm for including him in meaningful work. "I'd need to discuss it with Daniel, of course. And I wouldn't want to compromise my responsibilities here at the bakery." "Of course not," Marcus said quickly. "Susan's been good to you both, and I respect that loyalty. I was thinking Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday afternoons, times when the bakery is typically slower." Susan finally looked up from her pastry arrangement. "Actually, that might work perfectly. Those are exactly the times when I usually catch up on my own bookkeeping and planning for the next day," as Marcus departed with promises to discuss details. Further, Margaret found herself both excited and apprehensive about this new development. The practical benefits were obvious, but she couldn't ignore the personal implications of spending regular time at Marcus Donovan's ranch. "He likes you," Susan observed once they were alone again. "It's a business arrangement," Margaret replied, though she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Margaret Hayes, I may not be married, but I'm not blind either." Susan's tone was gentle, but knowing. "Marcus Donovan is a good man who's been alone too long. And unless I'm very much mistaken, you're not entirely indifferent to him either." Before Margaret could formulate a response, Daniel returned from his morning deliveries, full of news about the people and conversations he had encountered. "Mrs. Patterson says the church social is next weekend, and everyone's supposed to bring a covered dish," he reported. And Mr. Hendricks at the hotel says business is so good they might need to build another floor. Oh, and there's a new family. Moving to town next month. They have a boy who's 8. Margaret smiled at her son's enthusiasm for community news. In just 3 weeks, Daniel had become more socially connected than she had managed in some places they had lived for months. That's wonderful news about the new family. You'll have a friend closer to your own age. And Mrs. Ashford asked me to tell you that she's looking forward to your visit this afternoon, Daniel continued. She seems very nice, even though she talks fancy. That afternoon, Margaret made her way to the Ashford ranch with a wagon load of pastries and a sense of curiosity about Victoria Ashford's true motivations. The Ashford property was impressive, with a substantial house surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and pastures filled with high-quality cattle. Victoria met her at the front door, elegant even in her everyday dress, and personally oversaw the arrangement of pastries in her formal dining room. Perfect as always, Victoria said, examining a particularly elaborate cake. Susan does exceptional work. She does indeed. I'm fortunate to work with someone so skilled and generous. Victoria studied Margaret with the same frank assessment she had employed during their first meeting. Walk with me, she said, leading Margaret onto the wide front porch that overlooked the ranch's main pastures. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching horses graze in the golden afternoon light. Finally, Victoria spoke. I've been observing your integration into our community, Mrs. Hayes. You've handled yourself well under difficult circumstances. Thank you. Everyone has been very kind for the most part. For the most part, yes. Victoria's tone sharpened slightly. But not everyone, and that's what I wanted to discuss with you. Margaret waited, sensing that Victoria had something specific in mind. Robert Whitman is not accustomed to having his decisions questioned or his authority challenged. Victoria continued, your presence here and your apparent success in establishing yourself despite his rejection represents exactly that kind of challenge. I never intended to challenge anyone. I simply wanted to build a life for my son and myself. Of course. But intentions matter less than perceptions in situations like this. Victoria turned to face Margaret directly. Whitman has been pressuring certain business owners to reconsider their relationships with you. Howard Beckham has been particularly active in these efforts. Margaret felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. I see. And have these efforts been successful? Some people are easily intimidated, others are not. Victoria's smile held a hint of steel. My husband and I fall into the latter category, as do several other influential families in the area. We believe in judging people by their actions and character, not by the circumstances that bring them to our community. I appreciate that more than I can say. However, Victoria continued, support has its limits. If you're going to thrive here long-term, you need more than just defensive allies. You need positive advocates, people who will actively promote your interests rather than simply resisting pressure against you. Margaret considered this carefully. And how does one acquire such advocates? By proving yourself indispensable, by becoming so valuable to the community that removing you would cause genuine hardship. Victoria's expression grew more animated, which brings me to my proposition. Proposition. I understand you're considering additional work with Marcus Donovan. That's an excellent start. But I have something else in mind as well. Victoria paused dramatically. How would you feel about organizing Clearwater's first annual harvest festival? The suggestion was so unexpected that Margaret wasn't sure she had heard correctly. I'm sorry? A community celebration to mark the end of the growing season. Music, dancing, food, games for the children, something that would bring together all the ranches and farms in the area. Victoria's enthusiasm was infectious. It would require someone with organizational skills, business experience, and the ability to coordinate with multiple vendors and participants. Margaret's mind raced with the implications. Such an event would indeed establish her as a valuable community member, but it would also put her directly in the spotlight, exactly where Robert Whitman and his allies could cause the most trouble. "It's an intriguing idea," she said carefully, "but wouldn't such a large undertaking require considerable support from established community members?" "It would indeed, which is why I'm proposing to co-chair the organizing committee with you." Victoria's smile was triumphant. "Let's see Howard Beckham argue against an event sponsored by the Ashford family." As Margaret rode back to town with Victoria's proposal spinning through her thoughts, she realized that her life in Clearwater had reached another turning point. The safe, quiet integration she had been building was about to be replaced by something much more visible and potentially much more rewarding, but visibility was a double-edged sword, and she would need to be very careful about how she wielded it. That evening, as she tucked Daniel into bed at the boarding house, her son surprised her with an observation that showed how much he had absorbed their situation. "Mama, are you worried about something?" Margaret smoothed his hair, considering how much truth a 6-year-old could handle. "I'm thinking about some new opportunities that might help us build an even better life here." "Good opportunities or scary?" "Opportunities?" His perceptiveness never ceased to amaze her. "Both, I think. Sometimes the best opportunities are a little scary because they're important." Daniel nodded sagely. "Like when I was scared to use Mr. Tom's big hammer, but then I made the prettiest nailhead you ever saw." "Exactly like that, sweetheart. Then I think you should do the scary opportunity," Daniel said with the confidence of childhood. "Because you're the bravest person I know, and you always make beautiful things happen." As Margaret kissed her son good night and prepared for bed herself, she carried his words with her like a talisman. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, but tonight she felt the solid foundation of love and purpose that made any risk worth taking. The first crisis came on a Tuesday morning in early November, when Margaret arrived at the bakery to find the front window shattered and glass scattered across the floor like fallen stars. Susan stood in the doorway, her face pale with shock and anger, holding a brick that had been wrapped in paper. "When did this happen?" Margaret asked, carefully stepping around the broken glass to reach her friend's side. "Sometime during the night. Mrs. Chen from the laundry next door heard the crash around 2 a.m. but didn't see anyone." Susan's voice trembled slightly as she handed Margaret the brick. "There's a note." Margaret unwrapped the paper with growing dread. The message was brief and unsigned. "Outsiders aren't welcome. Leave while you still can." "This is about me," Margaret said, the weight of guilt settling heavily on her shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Susan. I never meant for my problems to affect your business." "Don't you dare apologize for the actions of cowards who attack property in the dark," Susan replied fiercely. "This is exactly the kind of intimidation Howard Beckham specializes in, calculated to seem anonymous while delivering a very specific message." As they worked together to clean up the damage, boarding up the window until a replacement could be installed, Margaret's mind raced through the implications. The attack had been timed perfectly to cause maximum disruption with minimal risk of discovery. It spoke of planning and local knowledge, someone who understood the bakery's routines and the neighborhood's patterns. "Maybe I should consider their advice," Margaret said quietly, as they swept the last of the glass into a dustpan. "If my presence here is going to bring this kind of trouble, Margaret Hayes, if you even think about letting bullies drive you away, I'll be very disappointed in you." Susan's tone brooked no argument. "Besides, you forget that I've dealt with men who think intimidation is an acceptable solution to their problems. I didn't run from my husband's fists, and I certainly won't run from a thrown brick." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff William Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s who had been keeping the peace in Clearwater for nearly a decade. He examined the damage with professional thoroughness, asking detailed questions about timing and potential witnesses. "I'll investigate, of course," he told them, "but I have to be honest. This kind of nighttime mischief is hard to prove without witnesses. Whoever did this knew exactly how to avoid getting caught." "What about the note?" Margaret asked. "Surely that provides some evidence of intent." Morrison studied the paper carefully. "Could have been written by anyone. No distinctive handwriting. Common paper available at any store in town." He folded the note and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "I'll keep this for evidence, but don't expect miracles." After the sheriff departed, Margaret felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The escalation from legal threats to property damage suggested that her opponents were growing more desperate and potentially more dangerous. The morning's troubles multiplied when Daniel arrived for his usual delivery duties, took one look at the boarded window, and immediately grasped the situation with the quick intelligence that sometimes made him seem older than his 6 years. "Someone hurt the bakery because of us, didn't they, Mama?" Margaret knelt beside her son, choosing her words carefully. "Someone did something very wrong because they don't understand that good people deserve to be treated with kindness, regardless of where they come from." "Are we in danger?" Daniel's green eyes held a seriousness that broke Margaret's heart. "We're going to be very careful, and we have many friends who are looking out for us," she assured him. "But, sweetheart, if you ever feel scared or unsafe, I want you to tell me immediately. Promise?" Daniel nodded solemnly, then surprised her by straightening his small shoulders with determination. "I'm not scared, Mama. Mr. Tom says brave people don't let bullies win, and we're brave people." The afternoon brought Margaret's first scheduled work session at the Double D Ranch, and despite the morning's events, she was grateful for the distraction of new challenges. Marcus met her at the ranch house with a warm smile that faltered when he noticed her subdued demeanor. "Everything all right? You seem troubled." Margaret hesitated, uncertain how much to share about the bakery incident. But Marcus's gray eyes held such genuine concern that she found herself explaining the morning's events in detail. His reaction was immediate and fierce. "Cowards!" he spat, his jaw tightening with anger. "Attacking a business, threatening a woman and child. There's no honor in any of it." "I'm beginning to think maybe they're right, though," Margaret said quietly. "Maybe it would be better for everyone if Daniel and I moved on to somewhere else." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Margaret, look at me." When she met his eyes, his expression was intense and earnest. "Don't let fear make your decisions for you. You belong here, both of you. Anyone with sense can see that you've been nothing but a blessing to this community." The conviction in his voice stirred something deep in Margaret's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the growing attraction she had been trying to ignore. "How can you be so certain?" she asked. You barely know me. I know enough." Marcus's voice grew softer, more personal. "I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you're raising a fine boy who's respectful and curious and kind. I know you faced down Robert Whitman's rejection with dignity and grace." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "And I know that you've brought something to this valley that's been missing for a long time." "What's that?" "Hope," he said simply. "The kind of hope that comes from watching someone build something beautiful out of difficult circumstances." Before Margaret could respond to this unexpected declaration, they were interrupted by the approach of a young cowhand leading Daniel on a gentle bay mare. The boy's face was radiant with joy, his small hands confidently gripping the reins as the horse walked calmly beside its handler. "Look, Mama, Jake taught me how to post properly, and Buttercup here is the sweetest horse in the whole world." Daniel's enthusiasm was infectious, and Margaret felt some of her morning's tension ease at seeing him so happy. Jake, a lean young man with an easy smile, nodded respectfully to Margaret. "He's a natural, ma'am. Takes to horses like he was born. In the saddle. Mind if I show him how to groom Buttercup when we're done with the riding lesson?" "Of course. Thank you for being so patient with him." "No patience required. Boys eager to learn and quick to understand. Makes teaching a pleasure." As Daniel continued his lesson, Margaret and Marcus made their way to the ranch office, a small building adjacent to the main house that was, as Marcus had warned, drowning in paperwork. Bills, receipts, supply orders, and correspondence covered every available surface in a system that defied logic or efficiency. "I can see why you need help," Margaret observed, surveying the chaos with a mixture of dismay and professional interest. "It got away from me after my bookkeeper moved to San Antonio last spring," Marcus admitted, looking embarrassed. "I kept meaning to organize it, but ranch work always seemed more urgent." Margaret rolled up her sleeves and dove into the project with the systematic approach she had learned managing her late husband's store. Within an hour, she had sorted the papers into logical categories and begun to identify the most pressing issues requiring attention. "Your feed supplier hasn't been paid in 2 months, she informed Marcus, holding up a series of increasingly urgent notices. "And you have 3 different banks sending conflicting information about loan payments." "I knew it was bad, but not that bad," Marcus said ruefully. "No wonder Bill Patterson at the feed store has been giving me strange looks lately." As they worked side by side, organizing and prioritizing, Margaret found herself appreciating the easy companionship that had developed between them. Marcus was quick to understand her organizational system, and his questions showed both intelligence and genuine desire to improve his business practices. "Where did you learn so much about bookkeeping?" he asked as she demonstrated a new filing system for receipts, necessity mostly. "After my husband died, I discovered that he had been rather optimistic in his record-keeping. I had to learn quickly how to untangle the mess and figure out our true financial situation." Margaret's voice carried old pain, but also hard-won wisdom. "It was either that or lose everything to creditors I didn't even know existed." Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. "That must have been terrifying, especially with a young child to protect." "It was. But it also taught me that I was stronger than I had realized. Sometimes we don't discover our own capabilities until circumstances force us to develop them." "Is that why you answered Robert Whitman's advertisement?" "For security." The personal question caught Margaret off guard, but something in Marcus's tone, curious but not judgmental, encouraged honesty. "Initially, yes. I thought marriage to a successful rancher would provide stability for Daniel and respectability for both of us." She paused in her filing, considering how much more to reveal. "But I also hoped that eventually it might become something more than just a practical arrangement. Love, you mean? Companionship, at least. Mutual respect and affection. I had that with Daniel's father, and I missed it terribly." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks at the intimate direction of their conversation. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then spoke with careful deliberation. "For what it's worth, I think Robert Whitman is the biggest fool in Texas for not seeing what he had in front of him." Their eyes met across the cluttered desk, and Margaret felt the air between them change, charged with possibilities that had been building for weeks. Marcus's gaze held something that made her breath catch, admiration certainly, but also something deeper and more personal. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats and Daniel's excited voice calling, "Mama, come see how fast Buttercup can trot." That evening, as Margaret and Daniel made their way back to town in the gathering dusk, her son chatted enthusiastically about his afternoon adventures. But Margaret's thoughts kept returning to her conversation with Marcus, to the way he had looked at her when he spoke of Robert Whitman's foolishness. Their peaceful journey was interrupted by the sight of smoke rising from the direction of Main Street. Margaret urged their borrowed horse into a faster pace, anxiety mounting as they approached the town centre. The smoke was coming from behind the general store, where a large pile of trash and debris had been set ablaze. A crowd had gathered to watch the volunteer fire brigade extinguish the flames, and Margaret's heart sank as she recognized several familiar faces among the spectators, including Howard Beckham, who wore an expression of cold satisfaction. "Quite a coincidence," observed Eleanor Patterson, appearing at Margaret's side as she and Daniel dismounted. "First the bakery window this morning, now a suspicious fire tonight. Someone seems determined to create an atmosphere of unrest." "Was anyone hurt?" Margaret asked, scanning the crowd for Susan's familiar figure. "No physical injuries, thankfully, but nerves are getting frayed, and that's exactly what certain parties intended." Eleanor's voice carried a grim understanding. "Fear makes people do foolish things, and some folks are counting on that reaction." As if summoned by their conversation, Victoria Ashford materialized beside them, her evening dress incongruous among the work clothes and worried faces of the crowd. "Margaret, thank goodness you're safe. I was concerned when I heard about the incidents today." Victoria's presence immediately drew attention, and Margaret noticed several conversations pause as people strained to overhear what the influential ranch wife might say. "We're fine, thank you, but I'm worried about what all this means for the community." "It means we're at a crossroads," Victoria replied firmly, her voice carrying clearly to the surrounding listeners. "We can either let fear and intimidation drive away valuable community members, or we can stand together against those who think violence is an acceptable tool for getting their way." Her words sparked immediate murmurs throughout the crowd. Some approving, others less certain. Margaret realized that Victoria was making a very public statement of support, one that would be impossible to misinterpret or ignore. "Which brings me to an announcement," Victoria continued, clearly relishing the dramatic moment. "The organizing committee for Clearwater's first annual Harvest Festival will be meeting this Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the church social. All community members interested in supporting this exciting new tradition are welcome to attend." The announcement had exactly the effect Victoria intended. The gathered crowd buzzed with interest and speculation, the evening's troubles temporarily overshadowed by curiosity about this unexpected development. As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret found herself surrounded by neighbors expressing support and interest in the festival project. But she also noticed the harder faces at the edges of the gathering, those whose expressions held disapproval and calculation. The battle lines were being drawn more clearly with each passing hour, and Margaret realized that the coming days would determine not just her family's future in Clearwater, but the kind of community the town would choose to become. That night, as she tucked Daniel into bed at the boarding house, her son surprised her once again with his astute observations. "Mama, do you think the bad people will try to hurt us more?" Margaret considered lying, offering false reassurances that might comfort them both. But Daniel deserved honesty, and lies would not protect him from reality. "I think they might try, sweetheart. But I also think we have more friends than enemies, and our friends are strong and brave people who won't let anything bad happen to us. Like Mr. Marcus and Mrs. Victoria and Mr. Tom? Exactly like them, and like Mrs. Martinez and Mrs. Patterson. And Sheriff Morrison. We're not alone, Daniel. We're part of a community now, and communities take care of their own." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, then fixed her with those wise green eyes that sometimes seemed to see too much. "Mama, are you going to marry Mr. Marcus?" The question was so unexpected that Margaret nearly choked on her own breath. "What makes you ask that? He looks at you the way Papa used to look at you, and you smile differently when you talk about him." Daniel's matter-of-fact delivery made the observation even more startling. "Mr. Marcus and I are friends. Good friends who work well together. But you could marry him if you wanted to, right?" because I think he would be a good papa. And I think you would be happy. The innocent wisdom of childhood cut straight to the heart of feelings Margaret had been trying to avoid examining too closely. Did she want to marry Marcus Donovan? And more importantly, was she ready to open her heart to that possibility? Someday, perhaps, she said carefully, but for now, we're focusing on building our life here and proving that we belong in Clearwater. Okay, Daniel said simply, apparently satisfied with her answer. But Mama, I hope someday it comes soon. I like it when you smile the way you do about Mr. Marcus. As Margaret kissed her son goodnight and prepared for bed herself, she carried his words with her like a gentle benediction. Outside, the Texas wind whispered through the oak trees, carrying with it the promise of changes yet to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself to hope that those changes might include the kind of happiness she had stopped believing was possible. The Thursday evening meeting at the church social hall drew a larger crowd than anyone had anticipated. By 7:00, every chair was occupied and people stood along the walls, creating an atmosphere of electric anticipation that hummed through the packed room. Margaret sat in the front row beside Victoria Ashford, acutely aware that every eye in the room was focused on them, with varying degrees of curiosity, support, and skepticism. Reverend Samuel Mitchell, a kindly man in his 60s who had served the Clearwater community for nearly 20 years, opened the meeting with a brief prayer for wisdom and unity. As heads bowed and voices murmured, "Amen," Margaret caught sight of Robert Whitman entering through the back door, his presence immediately noted by the subtle shift in the room's energy. "Friends and neighbors," Victoria began, rising to address the gathering with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "We are here tonight to discuss something that could bring our entire community together in celebration of our shared prosperity and values." She outlined the vision for the Harvest Festival with practiced eloquence, describing a 3-day event that would showcase local ranchers and farmers, provide entertainment for families, and attract visitors from surrounding counties. As she spoke, Margaret watched faces throughout the room, noting the growing enthusiasm among most attendees. "The success of such an undertaking," Victoria continued, "will require the participation and support of every segment of our community, which is why I am pleased to introduce my co-chair for this project, Mrs. Margaret Hayes." Margaret rose on slightly unsteady legs, her mouth dry with nervousness. She had addressed customers and employees in her late husband's store, but never had she faced an audience where so much depended on her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Ashford, and thank you all for coming tonight." Her voice started soft, but grew stronger as she continued. "I know that some of you may have questions about my qualifications for this responsibility. I can only say that I have experience organizing community events in Missouri, managing vendor relationships, and coordinating complex logistics." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "More importantly, I believe in the power of communities to support and strengthen each other. I have experienced firsthand the difference between places where people are judged by their circumstances and places where they are valued for their contributions." A murmur of approval rippled through portions of the crowd, though Margaret noticed that Robert Whitman's section remained conspicuously silent. For the next hour, the meeting buzzed with suggestions, questions, and volunteer commitments. Martha Henderson offered to coordinate food vendors. Tom Bradley proposed a demonstration area for traditional crafts, and Dr. William Foster suggested medical stations for safety. Even some of those Margaret had expected to oppose the project seemed caught up in the enthusiasm. As the meeting wound down and people began forming small groups to discuss specific aspects of the festival, Margaret felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Marcus Donovan, his grey eyes warm with admiration. "That was well done," he said quietly. You handled the questions with grace and authority." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted, surprised by her own candor. "Couldn't tell. You looked like you were born to lead community meetings." Marcus glanced around the bustling room. "Walk with me. There's something I'd like to discuss." They stepped onto the church's front porch, where the November evening air carried the crisp promise of approaching winter. Stars blazed overhead in the clear Texas sky, and Margaret pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. "The festival is going to be a tremendous success," Marcus said, leaning against the porch railing. "But I suspect you know that's not really what tonight was about." Margaret looked at him questioningly. "Tonight was about the community making a choice," he continued, "about what kind of place Clearwater is going to be. And judging by the response there, most folks chose tolerance and inclusion over fear and prejudice." "Some did," Margaret agreed carefully, "but not everyone. I noticed that Mr. Whitman and his supporters didn't seem particularly enthusiastic." Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "Robert Whitman is discovering that his influence has limits. When push comes to shove, most people would rather support someone who's building something positive than someone who's just tearing others down." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Marcus turned to face her directly. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said weeks ago." The serious tone in his voice made her pulse quicken. "What is it?" "I didn't offer you work at the ranch just because I needed bookkeeping help." His words came in a rush, as if he feared losing courage if he spoke slowly. "I mean, I do need the help, but that wasn't my primary motivation." Margaret's breath ill caught. "What was it?" "I wanted to spend time with you. I wanted to get to know you better, to understand what makes you laugh and what worries you and what dreams you have for the future." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she had learned indicated his nervousness. "I haven't felt this way about anyone since my late wife, Catherine." The mention of his deceased wife surprised Margaret. In all their conversations, Marcus had never spoken of his past relationships or explained why a successful, attractive man in his early 30s remained unmarried. "I didn't know you had been married," she said gently. 5 years ago. Cholera took her the first winter after we were wed." Pain flickered across his features. "I thought I was done with love, that I'd had my chance and lost it. For 4 years, I believed that." And now, Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intimate register that made her heart race. "Now, I've met a woman who makes me remember what it feels like to want to share my life with someone. A woman who faces adversity with courage and kindness, who raises a son any man would be proud to call his own." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in his words. "Marcus, I know it's complicated," he continued quickly. "I know you came here expecting to marry someone else, and I know you're still establishing yourself in the community. I'm not asking for an answer tonight or even soon. I just needed you to know how I feel." Before Margaret could respond, the church door opened behind them, and Daniel emerged with Tom Bradley, who had apparently been entertaining the boy during the meeting. "Mama!" Mr. Tom showed me the drawings for the festival demonstration area, and there's going to be a whole section for metalworking. Daniel's excitement was infectious, providing a natural break in the intensity of the moment. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." Margaret's voice was slightly breathless, her mind still reeling from Marcus's declaration. Tom Bradley tipped his hat to both adults. "Evening, folks. Fine meeting tonight. This festival is going to put Clearwater on the map." He glanced meaningfully between Margaret and Marcus. "I'll walk the boy back to the boarding house if you want to continue your conversation." "Actually, we should head back too," Margaret said, needing time to process everything Marcus had revealed. "It's been a long day." As they walked through the quiet streets toward Eleanor Patterson's boarding house, Daniel chatted about the evening's discoveries, while Margaret wrestled with the implications of Marcus's confession. By the time they reached their temporary home, her son had extracted promises of future visits to both the blacksmith shop and the Double D Ranch. "I like Mr. Marcus," Daniel announced as Margaret helped him prepare for bed. "He's kind to us, and he makes you happy." "He's a good friend," Margaret replied carefully. "Mama, you know I'm not a baby, right?" Daniel fixed her with those wise green eyes that always seemed to see too much. "I know when grown-ups like each other the way you and Mr. Marcus do." Margaret sat on the edge of his bed, struck once again by her son's perceptiveness. "What would you think if Mr. Marcus and I, if we became more than friends?" Daniel considered this seriously. "Would we live at the ranch, with the horses?" "Possibly, if that ever happened. And would Mr. Marcus be my papa, like really and truly?" The longing in his voice nearly broke Margaret's heart. "Would you like that?" "Yes," Daniel said simply. "I miss having a papa, and Mr. Marcus is the kind of man who would teach me important things and keep us safe." Margaret kissed her son's forehead, marveling at the clarity with which a 6-year-old could see what adults made complicated. "We'll see what the future brings, sweetheart. But for now, let's focus on making the festival the best celebration Clearwater has ever seen." The following days passed in a whirlwind of planning and preparation as the festival committee threw itself into the monumental task of organizing the community's first major celebration. Margaret found herself at the center of a complex web of logistics, managing vendor applications, coordinating with performers, and overseeing the countless details that would determine the event's success or failure. Her days now split between morning work at the bakery, afternoon sessions at Marcus's ranch office, and evening festival meetings. The routine left her exhausted but exhilarated, as she discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The organizational skills that had served her in her late husband's store proved perfectly suited to managing the larger, more complex challenges of community event planning. More importantly, the festival work was having exactly the effect Victoria Ashford had intended. Margaret's competence and dedication were becoming impossible to ignore, even among those who had initially opposed her presence in Clearwater. When the committee needed someone to negotiate with the traveling performers from San Antonio, Margaret's business experience proved invaluable. When disputes arose between competing vendors, her diplomatic skills smoothed over potential conflicts. "You're transforming before my eyes," Susan observed one afternoon as they worked together in the bakery kitchen. "6 weeks ago, you were a frightened woman stepping off a train with nothing but hope. Now you're practically running this town." "Hardly running it," Margaret protested, though she couldn't deny the truth in her friend's observation. "Just trying to help where I can." "Margaret, there's a difference between helping and leading, and what you're doing is definitely leadership." Susan's expression grew more serious. "The question is, are you ready for what comes with that?" Before Margaret could ask what she meant, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Morrison, his expression grim as he approached the counter. "Ladies, I need to speak with Mrs. Hayes privately, if you don't mind." Margaret's stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. "What's wrong?" Morrison glanced around the bakery, noting the presence of several customers within earshot. "Perhaps we could step into the back room." Once they were alone, the sheriff's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. "Margaret, I've received some disturbing information that I felt you should know about immediately." "What kind of information?" "Howard Beckham has been making inquiries about your background. Specifically, he's been in contact with authorities in Missouri, trying to gather information about your late husband's business dealings and the circumstances of your departure." Margaret felt the color drain from her face. She had been honest about the general circumstances that brought her to Texas, but there were details about her husband's financial difficulties and the extent of their debts that she had shared with no one. "Has he found anything problematic?" Morrison's expression softened with sympathy. "Nothing that reflects poorly on your character, but information that could be misrepresented by someone with malicious intent. Your husband's business failure, the extent of the debts you inherited, the fact that you left Missouri with creditors still pursuing you." The relief Margaret felt was immediately overshadowed by new worry. "Is there anything illegal about our situation?" "Not illegal, no. But in the hands of someone like Beckham, such information could be used to undermine your credibility and position in the community." Morrison paused meaningfully, "particularly if it were to surface at a critical moment, such as right before the festival." Margaret understood the implication immediately. Beckham was preparing to launch a character assassination campaign designed to destroy her reputation precisely when her success would be most visible and most damaging to his client's interests. "What should I do?" "Get ahead of it," Morrison advised firmly. "Control the narrative by sharing the truth on your own terms, rather than letting Beckham twist it to his advantage." That evening, Margaret sat at the small desk in her boarding house room, staring at a blank piece of paper as she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she began to write. "To the citizens of Clearwater, I have recently learned that questions have been raised about my background and the circumstances that brought my son and me to your community. Rather than allow others to characterize my situation, I believe you deserve to hear the truth directly from me." She went on to explain her husband's business failure, the debts that had consumed their assets, and her decision to leave Missouri in search of a fresh start. She described the months of struggle, the difficult choices she had made, and her gratitude for the opportunities Clearwater had provided. "I have never claimed to be anything other than a widow seeking to build a respectable life for her child. I have worked hard to contribute positively to this community, and I believe my actions over the past 2 months demonstrate my character more clearly than the circumstances that brought me here. I share this information not because I am ashamed of my past, but because I believe in the importance of honesty and transparency in all my relationships. If there are those who feel that my previous struggles disqualify me from participation in community life, I respect their right to that opinion. However, I hope that most of you will judge me by my actions and contributions rather than by the difficulties I have overcome. Respectfully yours, Margaret Hayes." The next morning, Margaret delivered copies of the letter to the general store, the hotel, and the church, requesting that they be posted in prominent locations. By afternoon, her preemptive honesty had become the talk of the town, generating discussions in every business and gathering place in Clearwater. The response was more positive than she had dared hope. Rather than condemning her for her past struggles, most community members seemed to admire her courage in addressing the situation directly. Even some of those who had been neutral toward her expressed approval for her straightforward approach. "Brilliant strategy," Victoria Ashford told her that evening. "You turned Beckham's weapon against him by embracing the very information he intended to use for character assassination." But it was Marcus's reaction that mattered most to Margaret. He appeared at the boarding house just after dinner, requesting a private conversation. They walked together through the quiet residential streets, both deep in thought. "I read your letter," he said finally. "And?" Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression intense with emotion. "And I have never admired anyone more than I admire you right now." Margaret felt tears threaten at the sincerity in his voice. "Margaret, you could have hidden from your past, constructed elaborate explanations, or simply left town when the pressure mounted. Instead, you chose courage and honesty, even when it put everything you've built here at risk." "I was terrified," she admitted. I still am. That's what makes it courage. Marcus reached for her hands, holding them gently in his calloused palms. I told you the other night that I was falling in love with you. After today, I need you to know that I'm completely, irrevocably in love with you. Margaret's breath caught at the declaration. Marcus, I know the timing isn't perfect. I know you're still establishing yourself here, and I know the festival is consuming all your energy. But I also know that life doesn't wait for perfect timing. His grey eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. Margaret Hayes, will you marry me? The proposal was so direct, so heartfelt, that Margaret felt her careful defences crumble completely. This man loved her, not despite her struggles, but because of the strength she had shown in overcoming them. He wanted not just her, but Daniel as well, offering them both the security and love they had been seeking. Yes, she whispered, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Yes, Marcus, I will marry you. His smile blazed across his features like sunrise as he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that spoke of promise and protection and passionate commitment. When they finally separated, both breathless with the magnitude of what had just occurred, Marcus cupped her face in his hands. I promise you, he said solemnly, that neither you nor Daniel will ever face anything alone again. We're a family now, the three of us, and families stand together through whatever comes. As they walked back toward the boarding house, hand in hand, Margaret felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since before her first husband's death. The future was still uncertain. The festival still loomed as a major test, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, she was facing that future not as a single woman struggling to protect her child, but as part of a partnership built on love, respect, and shared commitment to building something beautiful together. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but tonight was perfect, exactly as it was. The morning of Clearwater's first annual Harvest Festival dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold and amber. Margaret stood on the front porch of the Double D Ranch House, watching the sunrise paint the distant hills while coffee steamed in her hands. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus's proposal, and in that time their lives had transformed in ways she was still learning to comprehend. The wedding had been a simple affair, held in the Clearwater Church with the entire community in attendance. Reverend Mitchell had performed the ceremony with obvious joy, and even some of those who had initially opposed Margaret's presence had offered genuine congratulations afterward. Daniel had served as ring-bearer with solemn pride, presenting the simple gold band that would join Margaret to Marcus, not just legally, but in the bonds of the chosen family. Now, as Mrs. Marcus Donovan, Margaret found herself preparing to oversee the culmination of weeks of intensive planning. The festival grounds stretched across the meadow behind the church, with booths and stages arranged in careful patterns that would maximize both foot traffic and safety. Vendors had arrived from as far away as Austin, drawn by word-of-mouth reports of Clearwater's ambitious celebration. Nervous, Marcus appeared beside her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. Excited, Margaret corrected, leaning back against his solid warmth. I keep thinking about how different everything is from 3 months ago. Better different, or just different? Margaret turned in his arms to face him, struck once again by the way his grey eyes held such genuine affection when he looked at her. Wonderfully, impossibly better. Their conversation was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats as Daniel galloped into the yard on Buttercup, his riding skills, now confident enough that Margaret no longer worried about every outing. Behind him rode Jake, the young ranch hand who had become both teacher and friend to the boy. "Mama! Papa Marcus!" Daniel called, using the title that had evolved naturally in the weeks since the wedding. The festival people are already setting up, and there's a man with trained dogs who can do tricks. Margaret marveled at the transformation in her son. The careful, serious child who had stepped off the train in Clearwater had blossomed into a confident, enthusiastic boy who approached each day with curiosity and joy. The security of belonging to a real family, combined with the mentorship of Marcus, Tom Bradley, and others, had allowed Daniel to simply be a child again. "Well then," Marcus said, ruffling Daniel's hair as the boy dismounted, "I suppose we'd better get down there and make sure everything's ready for our guests." The festival grounds buzzed with organized chaos as vendors completed their setup and performers prepared for the day's entertainment. Margaret moved through the organized confusion with practiced efficiency, checking on logistics, resolving minor conflicts, and ensuring that every detail met the high standards she had established. For Clearwater's inaugural celebration, "Mrs. Donovan," called Sarah Chen, who ran the town's laundry with her husband. "The judges for the pie contest want to know if they should start tasting at 10 or 11 o'clock. 10:30, Margaret replied without hesitation. "That gives the late entrants time to arrive, but ensures we finish before the noon meal rush." As morning progressed into afternoon, the festival exceeded even Margaret's optimistic expectations. Families from ranches throughout the county filled the grounds, children shrieked with delight at the carnival games, and the demonstration areas drew enthusiastic crowds, eager to learn about traditional crafts and skills. Margaret found herself standing near the blacksmithing demonstration, watching Tom Bradley explain the art of metalworking to a fascinated audience that included several children and their parents. Daniel stood at the front of the group, glowing with pride as Tom displayed the small horseshoe the boy had helped create during his recent lessons. "You should be proud," observed a familiar voice behind her. Margaret turned to find Victoria Ashford, elegantly dressed despite the informal setting, her usually composed expression showing genuine warmth. "Of Daniel, I always am." "Of Daniel, certainly, but I meant of yourself. Look around you, Margaret. This festival is bringing together people who might never have met otherwise, creating connections and friendships that will strengthen our entire region." Victoria's smile held deep satisfaction. More importantly, it's established you as an indispensable part of this community's leadership. Margaret glanced around the bustling grounds, seeing familiar faces mixed with new ones, watching neighbors discover shared interests and values. "It was your idea originally. The concept was mine, but the execution is entirely yours. There's a significant difference between having an idea and bringing it to life successfully." Victoria paused meaningfully. "I suspect this is just the beginning of your contributions to Clearwater's development." Before Margaret could ask what she meant by that cryptic comment, they were joined by Sheriff Morrison, his usually serious expression lighter than Margaret had ever seen it. "Ladies, I wanted to let you know that we've had visitors from 3 different counties asking about next year's festival. Seems word is spreading faster than we anticipated." "That's wonderful news," Margaret replied, though she felt a flutter of anxiety about the implications of increased expectations for future events. "There's more," Morrison continued, his tone becoming more official. "Howard Beckham approached me this morning. Wanted to discuss some concerns about crowd control and public safety." Margaret tensed, recognizing the signs of another attempt at official interference. "I told him," Morrison continued with evident satisfaction, "that in 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen a community event better organized or more safely managed. Suggested that if he had specific concerns, he should address them directly with the festival committee rather than trying to create problems through legal channels." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "How did he respond to that suggestion?" "About as well as you'd expect. But without concrete complaints or legitimate safety issues, there's nothing he can do officially." Morrison tipped his hat to both women. "Excuse me, ladies, I need to check on the horse racing competition." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself increasingly amazed by the festival's success. The food vendors sold out of specialties, the craftsmen received multiple commissions for future work, and the musicians drew crowds that spilled far beyond the designated performance areas. But perhaps most gratifying was the social mixing she observed throughout the grounds. Ranch families who rarely interacted were discovering common interests. Children from different economic backgrounds were forming friendships, and the arbitrary social divisions that had seemed so important to some community members were dissolving in the face of shared celebration. "Mama!" Daniel appeared at her side, slightly out of breath from excitement. "You have to come see the horse racing. Papa Marcus is competing, and Thunderbolt is the fastest horse in the whole world." Margaret allowed herself to be dragged toward the makeshift racing track, where a crowd had gathered to watch the final heat of the day's competition. Marcus sat astride his big bay gelding, Thunderbolt, at the starting line, alongside 5 other riders. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the competitive gleam in his eye. "He's going to win," Daniel declared with absolute confidence. "Papa Marcus told me that Thunderbolt loves to run fast, and Papa Marcus is the best rider in Texas. We'll see," Margaret replied diplomatically, though she privately agreed with her son's assessment. The starting signal sent 6 horses thundering down the makeshift track, hooves pounding against the packed earth as riders urged their mounts toward the finish line. Marcus and Thunderbolt pulled ahead early, maintaining their lead throughout the quarter-mile course to win by 2 lengths amid cheers from the appreciative crowd. Daniel jumped up and down with excitement as Marcus guided Thunderbolt back toward them, his face flushed with exertion and triumph. "Did you see, Mama? Did you see how fast they went?" "I saw," Margaret laughed, accepting Marcus's kiss as he leaned down from the saddle. "Congratulations, champion. The prize is purely symbolic," Marcus said, dismounting with fluid grace, "but Thunderbolt deserves recognition for his effort." As evening approached and the festival began winding down, Margaret stood with Marcus and Daniel on a small rise overlooking the grounds, watching families pack up their purchases and head home with tired but satisfied expressions. "I can't believe it's almost over," Daniel said, his voice holding the melancholy of a child whose perfect day was ending. "This festival is over," Marcus corrected gently, "but there will be others. And more importantly, all the friendships and connections made today will continue long after the booths are packed away." Margaret nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her husband's words. The festival had been successful as an event, but its real value lay in what it had created for the community's future. "Mrs. Donovan." A hesitant voice behind them caused Margaret to turn. She was surprised to see Robert Whitman standing a few feet away, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. "Mr. Whitman, I hope you've enjoyed the festival." "I have, actually, more than I expected to." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with whatever had brought him to seek her out. "I wanted to. That is, I felt I should." Marcus stepped protectively closer to Margaret, his expression wary but not hostile. "I owe you an apology," Whitman finally managed. "My behavior at the train station was inexcusable. I let my concerns about social propriety override basic Christian charity and human decency." Margaret studied his face, searching for signs of insincerity, but finding only genuine regret. "I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Whitman. I've watched what you've accomplished here, how you've contributed to our community, and I realize I was wrong about, well, about everything." He glanced at Daniel, who was watching the adult conversation with interest. "You've clearly raised a fine boy, and any man who couldn't see that doesn't deserve to be called a father." The admission was clearly difficult for him, but Margaret sensed its sincerity. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Whitman. What matters is learning from them." "Indeed." He nodded formally to Marcus. "Donovan, you're a fortunate man. I hope you appreciate what you have." "More than you can imagine," Marcus replied evenly. After Whitman departed, the three of them stood in contemplative silence as the last of the festival crowds dispersed into the gathering dusk. "Are you really happy, Mama?" Daniel asked suddenly, the question so direct it caught Margaret off guard. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "Sometimes you get a faraway look like you're thinking about sad things. I just want to make sure you're really, truly happy and not just pretending for me." Margaret knelt beside her son, moved by his perceptiveness and his concern for her well-being. At 6 years old, Daniel had already learned to read the subtle signs of adult emotions, a skill developed through necessity during their months of uncertainty. "I am really, truly happy," she assured him, "happier than I ever thought I could be again. Sometimes I do think about sad things, missing your first papa, remembering the hard times we went through, but those thoughts don't make me unhappy. And now, they just remind me how precious what we have is." Daniel nodded solemnly, then surprised her by turning to Marcus. "Papa, Marcus, are you happy too? Really and truly?" Marcus crouched down to Daniel's level, his expression serious and thoughtful. "Daniel, before your mama came to Clearwater, I thought I knew what my life was going to look like. I thought I'd spend my days working the ranch and my evenings alone, and that would be enough." "But it wasn't enough?" "No, it wasn't. I just didn't realize it until I met you and your mama." Marcus's voice grew warmer. "Now I can't imagine wanting any life other than the one where I get to come home to both of you every evening." "Good," Daniel declared with satisfaction, "because I like our family exactly the way it is." As they made their way back to the ranch house in the deepening twilight, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 months ago, she had been a desperate woman with limited options, willing to marry a stranger for the promise of security. Tonight, she was returning home with a husband who loved her completely and a son who had found the father figure he needed. The house itself had been transformed as well. What had once been the functional dwelling of a solitary rancher now bore the touches of a family home. Margaret's sewing corner occupied one corner of the main room, Daniel's carved animals were displayed on the mantelpiece, and the kitchen showed evidence of daily use by people who enjoyed cooking and eating together. "I have something to show you," Marcus said, as they settled in the sitting room after dinner, Daniel already nodding off against Margaret's side, despite his attempts to stay awake for adult conversation. He retrieved a letter from his desk drawer. His expression barely contained excitement. "This came today, addressed to the festival committee, but delivered to me as your husband." Margaret accepted the envelope, noting the official seal of the state of Texas. Inside, she found a formal letter from the governor's office, praising the success of Clearwater's Harvest Festival and requesting information about replicating the event in other developing communities. "They want us to help other towns organize their own festivals," Marcus explained. "They're offering funding and official state support for a regional program." Margaret stared at the letter, overwhelmed by the implications. "This would be significant, more than significant. It would establish you as a recognized expert in community development, with opportunities to travel and consult throughout Texas." Marcus's pride in her accomplishments was evident in every word. "But what about the ranch? What about our life here? The ranch will always be here, and so will I. But Margaret, you have talents that could benefit communities throughout the state. I would never want to hold you back from using those gifts." Margaret looked down at Daniel, now fully asleep against her shoulder, then back at the letter that represented possibilities she had never imagined. "Would you really support me taking on something this ambitious?" I would support you in anything that makes you happy and fulfilled, Marcus replied without hesitation. Besides, Daniel and I could travel with you sometimes. He's old enough to find educational value in seeing different communities, and I could always use the excuse to visit other ranching operations. As Margaret tucked Daniel into bed that night in the room that was now truly his own, decorated with his treasures and the things Marcus had carved for him, she marveled at how completely their lives had been transformed. "Mama," Daniel mumbled. Sleepily, "when we help other towns have festivals, can we make sure they know that families come in all different kinds?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Like how we're a family, even though Papa Marcus isn't my first papa, and how Mr. Tom takes care of his nephew, even though he's not married, and how Mrs. Martinez has Pablo, and considers him her son, even though he came from Mexico." Daniel's words were slurred with exhaustion, but his meaning was clear. Just that families are about loving people, not about how you got together. Margaret kissed her son's forehead, struck once again by his wisdom. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll make sure people understand that." Later, as she and Marcus prepared for bed in the room they now shared, Margaret found herself thinking about the letter and its implications for their future. "Are you worried about the opportunities it might bring?" Marcus asked, having noticed her thoughtful mood. "Not worried exactly, more amazed, I suppose. 6 months ago, I was a widow with no prospects, desperately hoping to find someone who would accept Daniel and me. Now I'm being asked to help shape community development policy for the entire state." Marcus pulled her into his arms, his expression tender with love and admiration. "You know what I think the real transformation has been?" "What?" "You've stopped seeing yourself as someone who needs to be accepted and started recognizing yourself as someone who has valuable contributions to offer." His hands cupped her face gently. "You were never the desperate woman you thought you were, Margaret. You were always someone worth treasuring. It just took the right circumstances for that truth to become obvious to everyone, including yourself." As Margaret fell asleep in her husband's arms, listening to the peaceful sounds of their Texas ranch settling into nighttime quiet, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this place of belonging and purpose. She had come to Clearwater seeking security and found love instead. She had hoped to blend quietly into an established community and instead had discovered her own capacity for leadership. Most importantly, she had wanted Daniel to have a father, and he had gained not just Marcus, but an entire network of adults who cared about his development and future. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for having a child had become a woman whose family was celebrated as an example of love's power to create bonds stronger than blood or convention. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was perfect exactly as it was. She had found her place in the world, not as someone who needed to be tolerated, but as someone whose presence made that world richer and better for everyone in it. And in the end, that transformation had required not just finding the right man, but discovering the strength and worth that had been within her all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.